There's something special about watching two dogs grow up together, especially when they're brothers. At the Sunset Valley Animal Shelter, Max and Rocky were more than just siblings. They were best friends who touched everyone's heart with their incredible bond. Their story began on a rainy evening when a kind truck driver found them huddled together under a highway bridge. They were tiny puppies then, no more than 8 weeks old, with matching brown spots on their white fur and those big, gentle eyes that seemed to look right into your soul. The truck driver couldn't just leave them there, so he brought them to the shelter, where their journey really began. From day one, the shelter staff noticed something different about these two. While other rescued puppies often fought over food or toys, Max and Rocky shared everything. When breakfast time came around, they'd eat from the same bowl, taking turns and never getting angry with each other. The sight was so sweet that the shelter workers would often find themselves stopping just to watch them. As the weeks went by, Max and Rocky grew bigger, but their connection only got stronger. Every morning, they'd wake up tangled together in their bed, looking like one big ball of fur. The moment their kennel door opened, they'd race out together, playing a game they seemed to have invented. One would grab a toy and start running, while the other chased after him, only to switch roles moments later. But it wasn't just their playful moments that showed how special their bond was. During thunderstorms, when most dogs would bark or hide alone, Max and Rocky had their own way of dealing with fear. Rocky would press himself against Max's side, and Max would rest his head protectively over Rocky's neck. Together, they'd wait out the storm, comforting each other without making a sound. The shelter volunteers loved taking them on walks, though it wasn't always easy. The brothers had mastered the art of tangling their leashes, not because they were poorly behaved, but because they couldn't bear to be more than a few feet apart. They'd weave back and forth, trying to stay close, their tails wagging in perfect sync. What really captured everyone's attention was their evening routine. As the shelter quieted down and the other dogs settled in for the night, Max and Rocky would sit side by side at the front of their kennel. They'd watch the sunset through the window together, their heads tilted at the same angle, like they were sharing secrets about the day's adventures. Visitors to the shelter couldn't help but fall in love with them. Kids especially would spend hours watching the brothers play, giggling at their silly antics. The pair had this amazing ability to make anyone smile, whether it was the way they'd chase each other's tails in perfect circles, or how they'd try to fit into the same tiny bed, even though they'd long outgrown it. The shelter staff tried their best to keep the brothers entertained. They'd hide treats around their play area, and instead of competing, Max and Rocky would work together to find them. One would point out the treat with his nose, while the other would carefully dig it up, and then they'd split it between them. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance. But what truly made their relationship special wasn't just the happy moments, it was how they looked out for each other when things got tough. When Max caught a cold and had to spend a day at the vet's office, Rocky waited by their kennel door all day, barely eating or sleeping until his brother returned. And when Rocky once hurt his paw during playtime, Max stayed right by his side, gently licking his brother's injury until it healed. As the months passed, potential adopters would come and go. Some would show interest in one brother or the other, but the shelter staff always explained that Max and Rocky were a package deal. They couldn't bear the thought of separating them. The brothers seemed to understand this too. Whenever someone would pay special attention to just one of them, they'd quickly show off their incredible bond, playing together or snuggling up close, as if to say, "We come as a pair." Nobody at the shelter could have guessed that their unbreakable bond would soon face its biggest test. But for now, Max and Rocky remained together, sharing their days in perfect harmony, teaching everyone around them about the true meaning of brotherly love. The morning that changed everything started just like any other at Sunset Valley Animal Shelter. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves through the shelter's open windows. Max and Rocky were curled up together in their usual spot, their breathing synchronized in sleep as the first rays of sunlight peeked through the blinds. Emmy, one of the longtime shelter workers, smiled as she began her morning rounds. She'd grown especially fond of the brothers over the past months, always starting her day by checking on them first. As she approached their kennel, both dogs lifted their heads, their tails starting to wag in perfect unison. It was impossible not to smile at their morning greeting, Max with his gentle head tilt and Rocky with his signature playful bounce. "Good morning, sweethearts," Emmy whispered, reaching through the bars to give them both a quick pat. She couldn't know that this ordinary morning would turn into one of the most emotional days the shelter had seen in years. Around mid-morning, a young couple walked into the shelter with their little boy, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The boy was clutching a worn stuffed puppy, and his eyes lit up the moment he heard the friendly barks greeting them. His parents explained they were finally ready to add a dog to their family, having just moved into a house with a big backyard. As Emmy led them through the shelter, she noticed how the little boy stopped at every kennel, waving hello to each dog. But when they reached Max and Rocky's kennel, something special happened. Rocky immediately bounded forward, pressing his nose against the bars to sniff the boy's outstretched hand. The child giggled, and that simple sound seemed to fill the whole shelter with joy. Max watched from slightly behind his brother, his tail wagging more slowly, almost cautiously. It was typical of their dynamic. Rocky was always the first to greet visitors, while Max played the role of the watchful protector. Nobody at the shelter could have predicted how this familiar scene would soon turn into a moment that would break hearts and test bonds. The family spent almost an hour with the brothers in the shelter's play yard. The little boy threw balls for them, laughing as both dogs chased after them together. His parents watched with growing smiles as Rocky gently retrieved the ball and brought it back, while Max supervised the whole game with attentive eyes. "They're both so sweet," the mother said, watching her son giggle as Rocky showered him with gentle kisses. But she hesitated, exchanging glances with her husband. "We really only planned for one dog. Our house isn't quite big enough for two." Emmy felt her heart sink. She'd had this conversation before with other potential adopters, always explaining how the brothers needed to stay together. But something was different this time. The connection between Rocky and the little boy was undeniable. Rocky had settled his head in the child's lap, looking up at him with those soulful eyes, while the boy gently stroked his ears. The father knelt down beside Max, giving him a gentle scratch. "They really are amazing dogs," he said softly, "but we have to be practical. We're first-time dog owners and taking on two at once." The shelter staff huddled together for a difficult discussion. They'd always insisted the brothers stay together, but watching Rocky with this family, it felt like a match made in heaven. The little boy had already started calling Rocky his best friend, and even the most hardened shelter workers couldn't ignore how perfect this family seemed for him. As the family filled out the adoption papers, Max seemed to sense something was different. He pressed closer to Rocky, their shoulders touching as they sat together. The shelter grew unusually quiet, as if everyone could feel the weight of what was about to happen. When it was time, Amy attached Rocky's new leash. A bright blue one the family had brought especially for him. Max's tail, which had been wagging all morning, gradually slowed to a stop. His eyes tracked every movement as Rocky was led toward the shelter's front door. At first, Rocky walked happily beside the little boy, caught up in the excitement of the moment. But halfway to the door, he looked back at Max. In that instant, it was as if he finally understood what was happening. He planted his feet, refusing to move further, his eyes fixed on his brother. Max stood at the kennel door, his whole body trembling. And then it happened. A sound that would haunt the shelter staff for days to come. It started as a whimper, built into a whine, and finally became a howl so filled with sadness that several volunteers had to turn away, wiping tears from their eyes. Rocky tried to pull back toward his brother, but the family gently urged him forward. The little boy, sensing Rocky's distress, wrapped his arms around the dog's neck and whispered something in his ear. Whatever he said seemed to calm Rocky slightly, though his eyes never left Max. As the shelter doors closed behind them, Max's howl echoed through the building one last time. The sound carried everything: loss, confusion, and a loneliness so deep it seemed to touch everyone who heard it. Emmy sat with him for hours afterward, her own tears falling silently as she watched him curl up in the corner of his kennel, making himself as small as possible in a space that suddenly seemed far too big for one dog. That night, as the shelter grew quiet, the empty space in Max's kennel seemed to echo with memories of all the nights the brothers had spent together. Nobody knew then that this heart-wrenching separation was just the beginning of an even more remarkable story, one that would prove that sometimes the most painful goodbyes can lead to unexpected new beginnings. The days following Rocky's adoption cast a heavy shadow over Sunset Valley Animal Shelter. The change in Max was heartbreaking to watch, like watching a bright light slowly dim until it barely flickered. The once playful dog who greeted each morning with a wagging tail now lay motionless in his kennel, his food bowl untouched and his favorite toys gathering dust in the corner. Ami, who had known the brothers since their arrival at the shelter, found herself spending extra time at Max's kennel before and after her shifts. She'd sit cross-legged on the floor, talking softly to him about anything and everything, trying to coax even the smallest reaction from those sad brown eyes. "Come on, buddy," she'd whisper, holding out his favorite squeaky bone. "Just a little play." But Max would only turn his head away, as if the very sight of the toy brought back too many memories of the brother he'd lost. The shelter's senior caretaker, Tom, had seen many dogs experience separation anxiety over his 20 years of work, but something about Max's grief was different. It wasn't just sadness, it was like watching someone lose half of themselves. Max would spend hours staring at the kennel door, his ears perking up at every sound, only to slump back down when he realized it wasn't Rocky returning. Even the shelter's most energetic dogs, who used to get Max and Rocky racing around the play yard, couldn't spark any interest. During group playtime, Max would find a quiet corner and curl up, his eyes distant, watching other dogs play with their kennel mates, just as he once had with Rocky. The shelter staff tried everything they could think of to lift his spirits. They brought in special treats, chicken nuggets, bits of cheese, even the fancy dog biscuits they usually saved for special occasions. But Max would just sniff them once and turn away. His appetite seemingly vanished along with his brother. One of the younger volunteers suggested playing videos of dogs on her phone, thinking the sounds might comfort him. For a brief moment, Max's ears perked up at a bark that sounded similar to Rocky's, but when he realized it wasn't his brother, he seemed to sink even deeper into his depression. The shelter's vet, Dr. Lee, visited daily to check on Max's health. His weight was dropping, and his once shiny coat had lost its luster. "Depression in dogs is real," she explained to the worried staff. "They can grieve just as deeply as humans do." She prescribed some supplements to mix with his food, but getting Max to eat remained a challenge. Word of Max's situation spread through the shelter's social media pages. The post about the separated brothers, accompanied by a photo of Max's soulful eyes, touched hearts across the community. People began dropping by just to sit with him, reading books or simply offering quiet companionship. A local dog trainer volunteered her time, bringing calm therapy dogs to spend time with Max. While he didn't reject their presence, he showed no interest in interacting. It was as if he had built an invisible wall around himself, letting no one breach the space that Rocky once filled. At night, when the shelter grew quiet, Max's behavior was the most concerning. He'd pace his kennel restlessly, sometimes pawing at the spot where Rocky used to sleep. The night security guard reported hearing soft whimpers during his rounds, sounds that seemed to echo through the empty halls like a lonely lullaby. The staff tried rearranging Max's kennel, hoping a change of scenery might help. They'd moved him to a spot with a better view of the yard, added extra blankets for comfort, and even put up colorful pictures on the walls. But Max seemed to retreat further into himself, as if any change only emphasized Rocky's absence more strongly. Small things would trigger what the staff called his memory moments. The sound of the specific squeaky toy that he and Rocky used to play tug-of-war with. The sight of their old water bowl, which they'd shared countless times. Even the afternoon sunbeam that would stream through the window at naptime, a spot where the brothers used to lie together, seemed to bring fresh waves of sadness. 2 weeks into Rocky's absence, Amy arrived one morning to find Max had finally eaten a few bites of food. The entire shelter celebrated this tiny victory, but their joy was short-lived. Max retreated back into his depression the next day, as if allowing himself that small comfort had made him feel guilty. The shelter staff began to worry about Max's future. How could they ever find him a new home when he was so deeply depressed? Who would want to adopt a dog who seemed to have lost his will to live? They knew Max needed more than just a new home. He needed someone who would understand his loss, someone who could help him heal. What they didn't know was that fate was about to intervene in the most unexpected way. Sometimes, the universe has a way of bringing together two broken hearts, creating something beautiful from the pieces. For Max, this turning point was just around the corner, though nobody at the shelter could have predicted the remarkable change that was about to unfold. The morning sun was just beginning to warm the shelter windows when an elderly woman walked through the front doors. She moved slowly, leaning slightly on a wooden cane, her silver hair neatly pinned back. The shelter staff noticed right away that there was something different about her. She hadn't come rushing in asking to see the puppies like most visitors did. Instead, she quietly approached the front desk and introduced herself as Margaret Jenkins. Her voice was soft but clear as she explained that she wasn't necessarily looking to adopt. "I just read about your sad fellow in the newspaper," she said, "and thought maybe he could use some company." Emmy, who had grown increasingly worried about Max, led Margaret to his kennel. As they walked, she tried to manage expectations, explaining how Max hadn't been responsive to visitors lately. But Margaret just smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "That's all right, dear," she said. "Sometimes the best conversations don't need words." When they reached Max's kennel, Margaret did something unexpected. Instead of trying to get his attention or coax him over, she simply settled herself in a chair nearby, pulled out a weathered paperback book, and began to read. Max, curled in his usual corner, lifted his head slightly, the most interest he'd shown in days. Hours passed. Margaret read her book, occasionally turning a page, while Max watched her from his corner. The shelter staff went about their daily routines, stealing glances at this unusual scene. As closing time approached, Margaret carefully marked her place in the book, stood up, and quietly left, promising to return the next day. And return she did. Day after day, Margaret came to the shelter, always around the same time, always with a book in hand. She never forced interaction with Max, never tried to make him play or eat. She simply sat, read her books, and created a peaceful bubble of companionship that seemed to fill the empty space in Max's world. By the fourth day, something small but significant happened. Max moved from his corner to lie a bit closer to where Margaret sat. The movement was so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed, but the shelter staff held their breath, watching this tiny sign of progress. On the sixth day, Margaret began reading aloud softly. Her voice carried the words of classic stories through the shelter halls, tales of adventure, friendship, and courage. Other dogs in nearby kennels would quiet down when she read, as if they too were listening to her gentle storytelling. "My late husband loved these old stories," she mentioned to Emmy one afternoon. "He used to say that every good story needs both sunshine and rain to make it worth telling." As she spoke, Max raised his head, his ears perking up at the sound of her voice. Little by little, day by day, Max began to change. It started with small things, eating a few more bites of food, showing interest in movement around his kennel, standing up when Margaret arrived. The shelter staff watched in amazement as the dog who had been lost in grief slowly began to find his way back to life. One rainy morning, about 2 weeks into their routine, Margaret arrived at the shelter looking a bit more tired than usual. As she settled into her chair, she didn't open her book right away. Instead, she spoke quietly, seemingly to herself, though Max's ears were trained on her every word. "You know," she said, "it's been exactly 1 year since I lost my Robert. Some days, the house feels so quiet I can hear my own heartbeat." She paused, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I miss his laugh, the way he'd whistle while making breakfast, how he'd always leave his coffee cup in the oddest places." As she spoke, something remarkable happened. Max stood up, walked over to her chair, and for the first time since Rocky left, he initiated contact. He gently placed his head on her knee, looking up at her with eyes that seemed to say, "I understand." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she reached out to stroke his head. "Well, look at you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Seems we both know a thing or two about missing someone we love." The shelter staff watching from a distance had to wipe away their own tears. It was a moment of pure connection, two souls who had each lost a vital part of their world, finding comfort in each other's presence. From that day forward, Max waited eagerly for Margaret's visits. He still had his quiet moments, times when he seemed lost in memories of Rocky, but there was a new light in his eyes. When Margaret read, he would lie at her feet, occasionally nudging her hand with his nose when she paused too long between chapters. The transformation wasn't just in Max. Margaret too seemed to stand a little straighter, smile a little more. She started bringing treats for the other dogs, though Max always got the first one. She would share stories about her life with Robert, and Max would listen, his tail gently thumping against the floor. Nobody at the shelter could have predicted that grief could forge such a powerful bond. But as they watched Max and Margaret together, they began to understand that sometimes the best healing comes not from forgetting our losses, but from finding someone who truly understands them. As autumn leaves continued to fall outside the shelter windows, Margaret's daily visits became something everyone looked forward to. The shelter staff noticed how she would arrive a few minutes earlier each day, and how Max would perk up at the sound of her cane tapping against the floor tiles even before she came into view. One morning, Emmy found Margaret sitting in her usual spot, but without her book. Instead, she was telling Max about her home, a small house with a garden full of bird feeders and a back porch that caught the morning sun perfectly. "The squirrels are quite entertaining," she chuckled as Max listened intently. "They'd give you something to watch all day." It was clear to everyone that something special was growing between them. When Margaret would shift in her chair, trying to find a comfortable position for her Afridi kip, Max would get up and press himself against her legs, offering support. And on days when Max seemed to miss Rocky more deeply, Margaret would hum soft tunes that somehow always calmed him. The transformation in Max continued steadily. He started carrying around toys again, something he hadn't done since Rocky left. He'd bring them to Margaret, not to play, but almost like gifts, laying them carefully at her feet. She'd pick each one up and thank him as if he'd brought her precious treasures. "You know," Margaret confided in Amy one afternoon, "I never planned to adopt another dog after my old Lucky passed away last year. Losing him and Robert so close together, it just felt like too much." She watched as Max dozed peacefully beside her chair. But sometimes life has other plans, doesn't it? The shelter staff began to notice small changes in Margaret too. She started bringing a thermos of tea to share with them, telling stories about her years as a school teacher. Her eyes sparkled more, and sometimes they could hear her laughing, a warm, gentle sound that made everyone smile. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Margaret had her concerns about adoption. "I'm not as young as I used to be," she admitted to Dr. Lee during one of the vet's routine checks on Max. "What if I can't give him the exercise he needs?" Dr. Lee smiled, pointing out how Max had chosen to match his pace to Margaret's from their very first walk together in the shelter's yard. The staff worked together to address Margaret's worries. They connected her with a reliable dog walker in her neighborhood for days when longer walks might be challenging. Tom, the senior caretaker, offered to help pet-proof her house and install a few extra handrails near the back steps. Even the local pet store owner, hearing about the potential adoption, offered to deliver supplies directly to Margaret's home. As Margaret considered adoption more seriously, she started bringing photos of her house to show Max. She'd point out where his bed could go, right by the window in the living room, and describe the small fenced yard where he could safely explore. Max would study each picture carefully, his tail wagging gently, as if he could already imagine himself there. One rainy Tuesday morning, Margaret arrived at the shelter looking more determined than usual. She'd spent the weekend preparing her home, setting up a cozy corner with a plush bed and some new toys. But more importantly, she'd come to terms with something in her heart. "I realized," she told Emmy, her voice soft but steady, "that I've been afraid of loving again, afraid of losing again. But Max has taught me that it's worth the risk. We both know what it's like to have an empty space in our hearts, and maybe that's exactly why we need each other." The adoption paperwork was filled out slowly and carefully, with breaks for tea and stories. Max sat between them, occasionally nudging their hands with his nose, as if encouraging them to keep going. When Margaret signed the final paper, her hand trembled slightly, but her smile was bright. The shelter staff had prepared a special going-home package, Max's favorite blanket, the squeaky toy he'd started playing with again, and a photo album of his time at the shelter, including pictures with Rocky. "For the memories," Emmy explained, her eyes misty. "Both the old and the new ones you'll make together." As they prepared to leave, something beautiful happened. Max, who had been watching Margaret gather her things, walked to his kennel one last time. He sniffed the corner where he and Rocky used to sleep, then turned and walked back to Margaret, pressing against her leg as if to say, "I'm ready now." The entire shelter staff gathered to say goodbye, many of them wiping away tears. But these weren't sad tears like the ones they'd shed when Rocky left. These were tears of joy, of hope, of seeing two broken hearts finding a way to be whole again. As Margaret and Max walked out of the shelter together, their pace perfectly matched, the staff could hear Margaret's gentle voice. "Come on, dear heart, let's go home." And Max, his tail wagging steadily, stepped forward into his new life, ready to both heal and help heal in return. 3 months had passed since Max moved in with Margaret, and spring was just beginning to paint the world in fresh colors. The pair had settled into a comfortable routine, morning walks to the corner cafe where the owner always had a dog treat ready, afternoon reading sessions in the garden, and peaceful evenings watching the sunset from the back porch. Max had grown stronger and happier in his new home. His coat was shiny again, and his eyes had regained their sparkle, though sometimes Margaret would still catch him staring into the distance, as if remembering his brother. On those days, she'd sit a little closer to him, sharing stories about her own brother who lived far away in another state. That particular Sunday started like any other. Margaret and Max were taking their usual walk to the local dog park, a small but well-kept space where Max liked to watch other dogs play, even if he rarely joined in. The spring breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, and Max trotted contentedly beside Margaret, matching his pace to her careful steps. As they approached the park entrance, Max suddenly froze. His ears shot forward, his nose lifted to the air, and his tail began to quiver. Margaret had never seen him react this way before. "What is it, dear?" she asked, but Max's attention was completely focused on something in the distance. Then they heard it, a familiar bark that made Max's whole body tremble with recognition. Before Margaret could process what was happening, a white and brown blur came racing around the corner of the park. Time seemed to stand still as Max and Rocky locked eyes across the grass. For a split second, neither dog moved. It was as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Then, with a joy that seemed to burst from their very souls, both dogs rushed toward each other. Margaret had never seen Max move so quickly, yet he was still gentle enough not to pull her off balance as she held his leash. The reunion was something that brought tears to every eye in the park. The brothers spun in circles around each other, tails wagging so hard their whole bodies shook. They pressed their faces together, sniffing and nuzzling, whimpering with happiness. Rocky would bounce away for a moment, then race back to Max, as if making sure his brother was really there. The little boy who had adopted Rocky came running up behind him, his parents following close behind. "Look," he shouted with delight, "Rocky found his brother." The pure joy in his voice matched the scene perfectly. Margaret introduced herself to Rocky's family, and they all watched in amazement as the brothers rolled in the grass together, playing as if they had never been apart. Rocky showed off his new tricks for Max, while Max gently played with the little boy, something he had never done with other children at the park before. "We live just 3 blocks away," Rocky's mom explained, wiping happy tears from her eyes. "We had no idea you and Max were so close." The parents exchanged phone numbers with Margaret, all of them agreeing that the brothers needed to see each other regularly. As the afternoon went on, other park visitors stopped to hear the story. Many of them had seen Max and Margaret on their daily walks, always peaceful and quiet together. But today, they saw a different side of Max, playful, energetic, and absolutely overjoyed. Someone even captured a video of the reunion on their phone, and within days it would touch hearts across the internet. The little boy sat with Margaret on a park bench, proudly telling her all about Rocky's adventures at his new home. "He's the best dog ever," he declared, "but sometimes he looks sad, and now I know why. He missed his brother." Margaret smiled, sharing stories of Max's quiet days and how he too had carried his brother in his heart. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, it was time to head home. But this time, there were no howls of sadness, no heart-wrenching goodbyes. Instead, there were wagging tails and happy barks, because both brothers knew this wasn't an ending, it was a new beginning. The families arranged to meet at the park every Sunday afternoon. They'd also planned play dates in each other's backyards and even talked about taking the dogs on trips to the beach together. The little boy suggested they should have brother birthday parties for Max and Rocky, an idea that made everyone laugh and agree immediately. Walking home that evening, Max stayed closer than usual to Margaret, occasionally looking up at her with eyes full of gratitude. It was as if he understood that she had helped him heal enough to truly enjoy this reunion with his brother. Margaret patted his head gently, understanding the message in his gaze. That night, as they sat on their back porch watching the stars come out, Margaret noticed something different about Max's contentment. The lingering sadness that had always been there, even in his happiest moments, was gone. In its place was a peaceful joy, the kind that comes from knowing that you haven't lost what you thought was gone forever. It was just waiting to be found again in a new way. A year had passed since that magical day in the dog park, and life had blossomed in ways no one could have predicted. The story of Max and Rocky's reunion had spread far beyond their little community, touching hearts and inspiring others to consider adopting older dogs and siblings from shelters. Margaret's house, once so quiet she could hear the clock ticking, now buzzed with energy and life. Every Sunday afternoon, the sound of paws and laughter filled her backyard as Rocky and his family came to visit. The little boy would help her water her garden while the brothers chased butterflies and played their favorite games. The changes in Max were remarkable. His morning walks with Margaret had become a neighborhood highlight, with neighbors often stopping to chat and offer treats. He'd learned to carry Margaret's small shopping bag when they visited the corner store, proud to help his human friend. On rainy days, he'd fetch her slippers and lie beside her as she read, just like in their shelter days. Rocky had grown into his role as a family dog beautifully. He'd become a gentle guardian to the little boy, waiting patiently by the front window each afternoon for the school bus to return. His family often joked that he could tell time, because every Sunday morning he'd sit by the door tail wagging, knowing it was brother visit day. The bond between the two families grew stronger with each passing month. They celebrated holidays together, shared meals in Margaret's garden, and even took a summer trip to a dog-friendly beach house. The sight of the brothers racing along the shoreline, playing in the waves together, was something none of them would ever forget. Margaret's home had become a gathering place, filled with the warmth of friendship and shared joy. She taught the little boy how to bake dog treats, using her grandmother's cookie cutters to make bone-shaped biscuits that both dogs adored. The boy's parents often remarked how blessed they would have gained not just a pet, but an entire extended family. The shelter staff, who still kept in touch, were amazed by the transformation. Andy would visit sometimes, bringing news of other successful adoptions inspired by Max and Rocky's story. The brothers had become local celebrities of sorts, their story encouraging people to look past age or separation anxiety when choosing a shelter pet. Max still had his quiet moments, times when he'd rest his head on Margaret's lap and just breathe in the peace of their shared life. But now these moments weren't filled with sadness, they were peaceful pauses in a life rich with love and connection. Margaret would stroke his ears and tell him stories about Robert, knowing that Max understood the importance of keeping memories alive while embracing new joy. The little boy had grown too, learning valuable lessons about love and family through his experience with Rocky. He'd started a project at school about shelter dogs, proudly sharing photos of Rocky and Max to show how adoption could change lives. His teacher invited Margaret to class one day to share their story, and the children sat spellbound as she described how two broken hearts had helped each other heal. The regular park meetups had become a community event of sorts. Other dog owners would time their visits to coincide with the brothers' playdates, drawn by the infectious joy of their reunions. Even after a year, Max and Rocky's excitement at seeing each other never dimmed. They'd greet each other with the same boundless enthusiasm every single time. Margaret's garden had flourished that year, much like her heart. She'd added a special section of pet-safe flowers that both dogs loved to sniff, and a small water fountain that became their favorite drinking spot during play sessions. The brothers had worn a happy path between their favorite spots in the yard, a physical reminder of their regular visits. Rocky's family had installed a special gate between their backyards, allowing for easier visits when the weather was nice. They'd often find Max and Rocky lying in the sun together, their breaths synchronized just like in their shelter days, but now in a garden filled with flowers instead of between kennel walls. The impact of their story reached far beyond their own lives. The local shelter had started a Brothers Like Max and Rocky program, working harder to keep bonded pairs together when possible, but also ensuring that separated siblings could still maintain connections with proper planning and dedicated families. As Margaret watched the brothers play one sunny afternoon, she reflected on how life had surprised her. She'd gone to the shelter that day simply hoping to offer comfort to a grieving dog, never expecting to find a new purpose for her own grief-touched heart. Now her days were full of love, laughter, and the kind of joy that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. The story of Max and Rocky proved that sometimes endings are really beginnings in disguise. Their separation, which had seemed so tragic at first, had led to an even richer kind of connection, one that encompassed not just the brothers, but two families brought together by love, understanding, and the remarkable healing power of open hearts. As the sun set on another Sunday gathering, with the brothers dozing peacefully side by side on the porch and their families chatting over lemonade in the garden, it was clear to everyone that love has a way of writing its own story, one that's often more beautiful than anything we could have planned.